Archaeonauts, away!
I make this video not with the intention of trying to make people distrust science or to put science in a negative light, but just to show why you can't always blindly trust what science supposedly says all of the time. Sometimes scientists make errors, and occasionally some of them lie. They can also be influenced by their own biases. I'll use a famous example of an atheist, Richard Dawkins. To paraphrase something he said in a Q&A in a video I saw him in, Dawkins has said he doesn't know if anything could convince him that God exists, because even if God appeared in the sky and said, "I am God," it could still be explained away as something else. Maybe hallucination or a trick of technology or aliens. So essentially he admits nothing could convince him of the existence of God, even if there was evidence. It's like a religious belief, because no matter what evidence he is presented with, instead of accepting it, he would stick to his beliefs and look for another explanation. In Dawkins' case, it's easier for him to believe in aliens he can't prove the existence of, but somehow God is too far-fetched. Now, to be fair, I'm not skeptical of the existence of aliens, but I'm also not saying I don't believe in God. If you can believe in aliens you can't see or find, how is believing in God so far of a stretch for you to essentially say nothing could convince you? I'm picking on Dawkins here because he is a famous example, but there are a lot of other people with that same mindset. When people develop a belief in something, whether it be God, the non-belief in God, or pretty much any other deeply held belief, it can be hard to convince them otherwise. It's easier to fool someone than to convince someone they have been fooled. This is how some people get into cults and have a difficult time leaving the cult, even if they want to. It's not just religious cults like the Jim Jones cult or Heaven's Gate, but can be in more mainstream topics too. Just think of some political or social views on certain subjects. I'm not going to name any examples here because this isn't a political video, but I imagine you can think of some examples of your own that you can insert here. But it isn't just traditional religious beliefs or opinions on political or social matters. It can also be belief in what science says. I like to call it Scientism. It's what people like Richard Dawkins preach and what his followers believe. It's what skeptics like Ben Radford or Michael Shermer are apologetics for. Although I'd say they're more cynics than skeptics. And it's funny to me how they seem to be used as an expert on any subject as long as they are saying something debunking or perceived to be debunking of whatever topic it is they are being asked about, because whoever is asking wants the topic debunked. It's not just about belief in God or not. Anything that doesn't fit into the materialist, atheist worldview these people have, they are always going to explain away as something else because that is their bias. They already believe that what it is that doesn't fit into their worldview can't be true, so they come up with some other explanation, or assume it is something that science will be able to explain one day. And how can someone be expected to disprove what science might explain someday in the future? But anyway, I digress. The point I want to make is that these scientism people have a bias, and that bias affects their analysis of a subject. They usually don't see it that way, as they will just claim all of their opinions are based on scientific data and evidence that can't be refuted. Well, I have a few problems with that. For one, sometimes data collected in an experiment may not always have only one way it can be interpreted. Another thing is, sometimes big money funds the science they want. I've seen many examples of scientists or professors being ostracized or blacklisted by universities because they chose not to toe the party line on some subject there is supposedly consensus on. If someone questions something and is wrong, then show they are wrong. Ostracizing someone or blacklisting them isn't showing that they are wrong. If you cut someone's tongue out, you might stop them from saying something, but you haven't disproven what they said. And it's not just the people who have been ostracized or blacklisted for questioning the validity of something, but it's the question of how many others won't publicly question the validity of some established opinion because they've seen others get ostracized or blacklisted for it, so they just keep their mouth shut to avoid losing their livelihood. And sometimes the funding for science comes from a patron who is ultimately expecting certain results. If the person receiving the funding wants to continue receiving that funding, they may be inclined to tailor their experiments to finding the results the patron wants. And the third thing is, sometimes they just get things wrong, and it's not always by accident. Sometimes they get things wrong on purpose, or by saying getting things wrong on purpose, I mean they just lie and make up the results they want. There are many examples of this in history. A famous one is the Piltdown Man hoax. In 1912, Englishman Charles Dawson and his paleontologist friend Arthur Smith Woodward presented a human skull and jawbone to the Geological Society they claimed they found in the Piltdown gravel pit in England. The skull and jawbone are estimated to be 500,000 years old and is considered to be an earlier version of man, a missing link between apes and men. In 1913, the fossils go on display to the public. This alleged find was considered fact until it was questioned decades later in 1949 when Dr. Kenneth Oakley of the British Museum did a fluorine test on the fossils and found they were no more than 50,000 years old. Additional testing was conducted in 1953 that found that although the human skull was fossilized, the jawbone was that of a modern ape and its teeth were filed down and stained to better match the skull. The fact that the ape jawbone was filed and stained to better match with the skull indicates this was probably a fraud and not just a mistake of mixing two different fossils together. The Piltdown exhibit in the British Museum was quickly changed from presenting the Piltdown skull and jawbone as a fact of science to an exhibit showing how the scientific world was duped by a hoax. I don't know what Charles Dawson's intention in presenting the fraudulent discovery was. Maybe it was for fame and fortune. But I also have to wonder if he just wanted to present evidence to others of what he already believed to be true because he had a bias towards believing in evolution. For decades, scientists believed the Piltdown Man was evidence of a missing link between apes and man, thinking it was proof of Darwinian evolution, but eventually they were proven wrong by someone doing real science. But it took 4 decades to get to the truth, and that wasn't even the last time someone hoaxed a missing link fossil. You can find other examples of fraud in archaeology and paleontology, but it's certainly not limited to that. You can find it in other scientific studies as well. There are times where questioning the results of some scientific studies shows the error or fraud of the research, like in these examples. I point these out to show that it does happen, and you have to wonder how often the fraud flies under the radar and isn't caught, or is caught, but moneyed interests cover it up to keep the fraud going.
Also, the science has changed.
I think it's probably easier to hide mistakes or outright fraud in some scientific studies than it is in others. Sometimes I feel like maybe some people give some studies of science too much credit for the successes of other types of sciences. And by that I mean scientific engineering that has developed things like our modern technologies and medical advancements may give some people the impression that the scientific research that brought us modern technologies is itself evidence that all scientific studies are highly irrefutable simply because they use the scientific method, or in some cases merely claim to have used the scientific method. But I don't think that's necessarily true. It's easier to make a mistake or lie about the date of a fossil, for example, than it is to claim that you can build a particular new technology and then not deliver on your claim. If a fossil is dated wrong, as long as you have an academic background, most people are just going to take your word for it. You're not going to have to demonstrate how you dated the fossil to everyone that comes along. And usually in a museum, most people are going to assume the descriptions of the exhibits in the museum are accurate. Most people visiting a museum aren't going to want to see detailed analysis of each exhibit. So I think it's easier to be wrong about something if most people don't need a demonstration of how you got your conclusions. You might not get away with it forever, like in the examples I've shown here, but I still think it's easier to be wrong in some sciences than it is in others, like engineering. Because if you claim you can engineer a new technology, you eventually have to show that you can. You can't fake it for very long, because most people are going to expect to actually see the new technology working. So what is the point here? I said in the beginning my goal wasn't to make people distrust science, but then I go on to present reasons why someone might distrust science. That isn't what I wanted to do. I just wanted to show why I don't think it's good to blindly parrot anything and everything science says. I think we are all guilty of parroting what someone says from time to time. We don't all have time to do a detailed analysis of every subject known to man, so sometimes we just have to take someone's word for something and go with it. But for the topics that interest you most, take the time to do your own research. Be willing to listen to differing opinions. Sometimes someone you might have already written off as a hack might be right about something. It's like the old saying, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Someone who has been wrong about a lot of things might get something right occasionally. For me, it's like that Ancient Aliens TV show. I haven't watched it in a long time, but I used to like watching it, but maybe not for the reason you'd assume I liked it. Oftentimes, I wouldn't agree with the analysis of many of the show's presenters, but some of the information they presented still gave me ideas of things to research on my own. They would sometimes show obscure archaeological sites or odd, seemingly out-of-place artifacts. They might say it was aliens that built it, and I might not agree with that, but if it was something I didn't know about before, I could do my own research on the subject and draw my own conclusions about it. And this is why I think it's good to consider opposing views sometimes. Ultimately, you might still not agree with the opposing view, but you might have learned something along the way. And consider what your own biases might be. Even if you make an effort to research a topic without bias, it can be hard to not let some bias creep in at times, even if you don't realize it. In some cases, even what topic you pick to research might be indicative of some degree of bias. Like, why did you pick that topic instead of another topic? A bias might lead you to certain topics. I don't think having a bias is necessarily a bad thing. It's just important to be aware of what your biases are when you're researching something. If you're not aware of what your biases are, then you might not be aware all you're really doing is just looking up information that confirms what you already believe to be true. So just do your own research on what's important to you. If science says it is true, most of the time it probably is, but not always. Those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening.